Noobs. Suppose you're looking at a deal on West 44th Street in Midtown Manhattan and you're presented with these 3 comparable properties. Each one of these is a 5-story walk-up in the same neighborhood. Comp number 1 sold for $6.5 million or $700 a square foot. Comp number 2 sold for $8 million or $650 a square foot. And number 3 sold for $7.2 million or $850 a square foot. Do you think the 44th Street property sold for A, $5 million, B, $7 million, or C, $9 million? Think about this while I subconsciously ingrain my brand into your mind. Before I give you the answer, let me introduce a special guest for this video, Nelson Lin. He's a real estate investor, data scientist, stand-up comic, and founder of the super popular Facebook group, Subtle Asian Real Estate. Feel free to join the Facebook group. It's got almost 7,000 followers as of this filming, and there's a ton of valuable information for people interested in getting into real estate. So head over there and join. You don't have to be Asian. Alright, Nelson's gonna give us some real-world equivalent examples of using comp studies the way we do in real estate. Take it away, Nelson.
What's up, noobs? Let's say you're about to pick a movie to watch, and you're a huge fan of Pacific Rim. You know, giant robots, totally not a Transformers knockoff. So now you're searching for movies that have robots and the word rim in the title, right? Because they're similar. And of course you run across Pacific Rim 2 and Atlantic Rim, which are obviously equally good, right? No, but somehow, of course, Pacific Rim 2 still managed to trick about $290 million worth of people into going and watching it at the movies. Example number 2. Okay, so now you really have nothing to do, and you consider watching Atlantic Rim. And on Rotten Tomatoes, it scored 9% across 200 reviews. You're not going to waste those 2 hours watching, right? However, when you buy a home, usually you only compare it to 3 to 5 other houses, and then you decide, okay, I guess it's time for me to sign on for the next 30 years. Example 3. Say I meet a girl, and this one is real, a real girl, and she has the average physical features of the last 3 girls that I dated. I guess it's time to marry her, right? I know I'm joking, but this is also probably too realistic of an example, and probably have such a high divorce rate if you think about it.
Do you want to change your answer to the opening question now? Take your time. I'm not giving you the answer yet. But by now, you might be thinking that picking 3 comps based on a few similar characteristics is pretty idiotic. Who would ever use just 3 comps? Is what I scream into a void, only to find that my sentiment is not echoed in this industry. This problem is systemic. Comps are used by city tax departments, institutional buyers, banks, and investors to assess value, support pro forma inputs, and predict the future value of the highest and best use of a property. And most of the time, these super sophisticated institutions are okay with less than 10 comps that are questionable in their similarity. Let's dive into some math without numbers about why this is a really bad statistical practice. First, depending on who prepares the comps for you, there's probably a degree of sample bias, which is when someone either consciously or subconsciously selects properties with the same traits while ignoring others. Brokers do this all the time if they're trying to support a case for a listing price. And if you already like a property and you embrace their comps at face value, you're falling for your own confirmation bias, which is when you selectively accept evidence that supports your beliefs. If you don't do your own comp study and you're presented with 3 to 5 comps from a broker who has an ulterior motive to sell a property to you at the highest price possible, it's hard to tell if there's anything wrong with the numbers. And it's especially hard if you're not from the area. Professor Nelson's gonna show us what can happen if you cherry pick listings to represent a neighborhood.
One of the biggest problems with using only 3 to 5 comps is that it's not very statistically significant. Like, a lot of brokers will give you an average or make you assume that it's just enough to calculate the average of these comps. But in statistics, that usually assumes a few more things, one of which is that the samples are normally distributed and that enough of them exist so that the central limit theorem applies. Now, in normal person speak, what that means is you're going to want your sample size to be greater than 30 before you can really start using the mean and standard deviations to a high degree of confidence. It's kind of the way a lot of science works, but do you know how many brokers have given me 30 samples on a property? 0. So this chart shows you what happens when your sample distribution starts increasing in the number of sample sizes. So the graph starts getting taller and skinnier, which is a good thing because now that means you're much more confident that the true value, the true mean, falls somewhere within that range, the standard deviation. And an opposite, that means the less samples you have, the graph is going to get shorter and fatter. And that just means you're less confident and your mean will probably be less accurate and less useful as a number to you. So in real estate, what we're trying to say is you shouldn't just use the average price of the comparisons to judge a neighborhood unless you have at least 30 samples in this study. Next, real estate, hyperlocal. Take a look at this map. Red points are more expensive here and closer to the train line, justifying the cost. And then you have these green points that are kind of further away and they're cheaper on average. But if you don't live in the neighborhood, you wouldn't realize that these rents just change block by block. So it's kind of easy to make a biased comp study where you only choose 3 to 5 without realizing that you're making a mistake when trying to calculate your returns.
Thanks, Nelson. But the problems don't end there. Supposing you find a large enough sample of legitimately similar comps, it still doesn't fix the bad practice of using it as a forecast when pricing when you exit. One of the most outrageous yet commonly used assumptions in real estate is that today's pricing, growing at 3% annually, is the best guess for tomorrow's pricing. Brokers use it, appraisers use it, banks use it, and investors are totally okay with it. Nelson, what's wrong with this? Chaos
theory states, and I'm totally verbatim here, if someone farts in the US, it'll cause a tsunami in Thailand. Alright, I'm embellishing a little, but the point here is that there's so many factors that affect pricing, and the further in the future you try to model, the less accurate you'll be. But with more data, we can get a little more confident, just not as confident as we try to seem, but that's just the nature of business. And the thing is, if you managed to model a pandemic into your pro forma in 2019, they would have been accurate, but you would have been laughed out of the room. So it's kind of the nature of how business is done, is someone just kind of pulls a number and says 3% rent growth.
You know what's really scary about the industry standard assumption of 3% rent growth forever? Trillions of dollars of assets are valued 3 to 10 years into the future this way, and these assets secure some of banking's most lowest risk securities. If my fart in New York creates a tsunami that wipes out beach resorts in Thailand that were supposed to grow at 3% annually, and it bankrupts a small fund that invested in them, which in turn jeopardizes the loans that were securitized by a debt fund that was backed by Fannie and Freddie, and then Nelson farts in Texas and causes the 10-year treasuries to rise by 3%, our industry will collapse. By now, if you're even still watching, you might be saying, okay, engine nerds, how can we do better? Well, for one, Nelson and I should stop farting, but he's got better ideas.
A good place to start is to acknowledge that there's just too many variables to model, and that some of the most influential factors just don't really have data sets available. For example, like when Amazon was shopping around for a second headquarters, that was really just inside knowledge for just a handful of people at Amazon, and all the brokers in the target cities were just guesstimating where it'd end up. Another example, our upcoming zoning changes are usually negotiated with the city, and the thing is though, that's divided by the politicians, but that can also be influenced by real estate developers. But even they don't know how the votes are going to end up when the zoning decisions actually go on the ballot. And when you understand that your predictions really only work in perfect laboratory conditions, it's a lot more prudent and honest to offer ranges instead of just a single value. So usually you want to include things like sensitivity analysis for key variables, for rent growth and exit value, just to show how other key metrics change in relation to those numbers, especially your returns.
The key takeaway here is understand that all predictive models have flaws, and your predictions will most likely be off. Build confidence with the people you work with by explaining the risks and coming up with contingency plans so that everyone involved in the investment is prepared for the worst case scenarios. That kind of preparation is really what makes real estate a low risk investment. Oh, and I owe you an answer for the multiple choice question. The answer is D, none of the above, because a pandemic slashed the price in half. It closed at $3.8 million, around $400 a square foot. And at the time it closed, comps didn't mean shit. Special thanks to Nelson for doing this video with me.